Well, hello everyone. Buenas noches a todos. Socha, Ajituta Mashikuna. My name is Renzo Moyano. Thank you all for attending this virtual event organized by Word Up Community Bookshop. Word Up is a bookshop and art space run by local residents, many of whom are volunteers. We started as a 1-month-long pop-up shop in 2011, then stuck around due to overwhelming community demand. And this past June, we celebrated our 10th birthday. We can be found at 2113 Amsterdam Avenue at the corner of 165th Street in Washington Heights, New York City. We host events for all ages and sell used and new books in English and Spanish. You can check us out at wordupbooks.com to shop and see other virtual and outdoor events that we are hosting. We are currently open Tuesdays to Fridays from noon to 6 p.m. and Saturdays from 11 to 5. Now, for today's event, I am really, truly excited to be here introducing these two lovely women. First of all, because the topics that we are going to be exploring today are topics that touch me on a personal note. The topics explored in this book in particular are, as for me, who's someone who is an aspiring Quechua speaker with roots in Ecuador and an aspiring Muisca speaker with roots in Colombia, and as an animal relative of the frog. I know in the book we talk about animal relatives. In a time when it feels like we are experiencing an omni-crisis of sorts with climate change, a global pandemic, and even the attempted eradication of mainstream Latinidad through the white defensive response to critical race theory, Dr. Jessica Hernandez's book couldn't have come at a better time. And so a little bit about our guest. We have Dr. Jessica Hernandez, author of Fresh Banana Leaves, is a transnational Indigenous scholar, scientist, and community advocate based in the Pacific Northwest. Her work is grounded in Indigenous cultures and ways of knowing. She advocates for climate, energy, and environmental justice through her scientific and community work, and strongly believes that Indigenous sciences can heal our Indigenous lands. She is the founder of Pina Sol, an environmental consulting and artesanías, artisans hybrid business that supports Black and Indigenous-led conservation and environmental projects through community mutual aids and microgrants. Her book, which we will be exploring tonight, Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science, is out today. And joining us as well is Diane Wilson from the Dakota Nation, is an author and author of The Seed Keeper, also author of Spirit Car, Journey to a Dakota Past, as well as Beloved Child, A Dakota Way of Life. She has won multiple awards for her work. Her most recent essay, Seeds for 7 Generations, was featured in the anthology A Good Time for the Truth, Race in Minnesota. Wilson is the former executive director for the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, a national coalition of tribes and organizations working to create sovereign food systems for Native people. She is the Wakantan descendant, enrolled on the Rosebud Reservation, and lives in Schaefer, Minnesota. Mm-hmm. I want to welcome both of you. Thank you for connecting with us. We at Word Up are very honored to be a part of your book launch. And so please take it away.
Thank you, Renzo. Mitakiapi, Diane Wilson, Namakiapia. Bedewakantuan oyate hamatahaya. Sichangu oyate edo mawapia. Hello, all my relatives. It's really good to see you here tonight. My name's Diane Wilson. I'm a Bedewakantuan descendant, and I am enrolled on the Rosebud Reservation. And I am speaking to you tonight from Minnesota, where, yes, it is very cold, just as you might expect, and I am on Dakota land. So we are deep in winter, which for us is a time of storytelling. It's also the dream time when our trees and our plants and our animals are all dormant. They're all dreaming of what spring will bring to them this year. And so I have to say for myself, it also feels like very much a quiet time. But when that email came in announcing Dr. Jessica Hernandez's new book, I have to say that in that moment, my heart just said yes, that this is a story that we need to hear now. And especially, I think, when we're in this dark contemplative time and we have that energy to think about a new way of being in the world. And I think I'm so grateful to be here, and it is such an honor to be in conversation with Dr. Jessica Hernandez and to hear a story through the voice of a young Indigenous woman leader. This is what truly gives me hope for the future. And so tonight we're going to start with Jessica actually diving right into the book with a reading, and then we're going to have a conversation about some of the themes in the book. So Jessica.
As I was introduced, I'm Jessica Hernandez, and thank you for having me here today. I'm currently calling from Kapawal territories, also known as Little Rock, Arkansas. So thank you, Diane, and I will start the reading. Taking care of nature and nature taking care of us in return is the greatest teaching my father has taught me. Indeed, nature protects us as long as we protect nature. This is something Western science has failed to understand or explain. Settler colonialism introduced ideologies and beliefs that nature is meant to provide us with resources to meet our needs without requiring us to protect it as well. Nature has been described as an infinite sink, and this is what has led to overfishing, overharvesting, and essentially environmental degradation. Environmental degradation is the destruction that continues to occur in our environments. It is why our environment continues to face severe droughts, wildfires, and other natural resources, and our ecosystems continue to decline. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. That to me is just one of the most important themes in the book. The idea that if we take care of nature, that nature also takes care of us. But I want to start with kind of a general question. As a writer, I'm always fascinated with knowing why another writer has chosen this book at this time to write and share with the world. So I'm wondering if you could tell us some about your personal story and just why you wrote this book.
Thank you for your question. And it was, fortunate for me. I received the contract before the pandemic started. So it was, excitement that I felt. But, after that in 2020, that's when the pandemic kind of amplified and, it led us to many disparities. I think that because of the pandemic and being able to write during the pandemic, I wanted the book to be a healing process for me, especially, as the pandemic kind of brought to the surface many of those injustices, many of those levels of oppression that as Indigenous peoples we continue to face. One of the main reasons why I wanted to write this book was because I always wanted to write my father's story. So as the book recalls and it kind of tells, my father was an Indigenous child soldier during the Central American Civil War. And ever since I was little and as I went into higher academia, most of the Central American Civil War historical accounts were written from a non-Indigenous lens. Even though the Central American Civil War has been determined to have been a genocide against Indigenous peoples by the United Nations, there was nowhere to find any Indigenous narratives or any Indigenous lived experiences. All of those lived experiences could be found through our people, right? Through storytelling, as oral storytelling, as opposed to something that's been written. So I wanted to write the book that started with my father's story and embody the teachings that he had provided me, especially as he's getting older. And it's something that I continue to see it manifest in our generations. And I think that given that climate change is displacing a lot of my people, especially from Central America, and seeing how instead of the United States kind of welcoming them with dignity and respect, they're criminalizing them, right, because of the immigration policies. And, you know, unfortunately, a lot of the children that are being kept in cages are indigenous Mayan children. But yet, when you read stories about the, you know, the children in cages, their indigeneity is not mentioned, because oftentimes we are, you know, labeled as Latinx or Latina, even though, you know, there are different races within the Latinidad or the Latinx identity, right? And one of them is being an indigenous person. So I guess, you know, it was like a healing process for me. And it was also a reflection that I wanted to amplify the lived experiences and testimonies that are often ignored. And I think that even, you know, studying environmental sciences and being an environmental scientist, oftentimes people don't see the connection between environmental justice and displacement and immigration. And, you know, in the book, I kind of tied those three things and kind of show people a pathway that kind of determines how they're all interconnected.
So one of the things I really appreciated about your book is the way in which you connected your lived experience and that of your family with this broader framework around colonialist history. And to me, that was really powerful because you could see from a personal story how that connects to this broader context. And it gives language to what's happening. And so I know that I was also really intrigued by the format that you used in combining both your own language, but then the interviews that you clearly did with a number of people who are important to your story. And one of those people is your father and his personal story that you just mentioned. I wonder if you could tell us a little more about his story, his experience during the war, and how that became the title for your book.
So his experiences in the war are kind of, you know, embedded in a lot of trauma. So I kind of want to mention like a content warning for our viewers, especially if they have experienced war or genocide in their lifetimes or their parents' lifetimes. It was during the 1960s when everything started, when it was like an indigenous resistance movement against oppression. And I say oppression given in the context that a lot of our lands was being stolen in large land grabs, and they were being sold to international corporations. And one of those corporations was introduced bananas, and that's why we have a lot of plantations. Even though, you know, South America, Latin America exports the most bananas, bananas are not native to our lands, right? They're, you know, an introduced relative or a displaced species. And I think that as a result of that, indigenous peoples and also the agricultural workers were joining forces to kind of combat that oppression that was happening throughout Central America. And because there was this fear of communism spreading, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras kind of receive a lot of support from the United States and Canadian settler governments to kind of aid them in providing you know, the army with resources as well as training. A lot of that training was actually violent, and a lot of that was embedded in kind of in, you know, making people fearful, right, that if they joined the guerrilla, which was kind of, you know, the resistance movement against the government, you know, their families will be killed. So because there was children, they were being forced to either join the guerrilla or the army, and the army will come knocking in their cantones, which is like our small pueblos, indigenous communities, to kind of recruit children. And if the children didn't want to join the army, they had to kind of seek the guerrilla, right, the opposing forces. And the army will use a lot of violent tactics. They will burn their homes, even if people were inside, because, you know, it was that fear that they wanted to ingrain in the children so they wouldn't join the guerrilla and kind of join them, because, they were kind of embedding this fear. And as a result, my father had no choice. So at the age of 11, after the army came multiple times looking for him to forcefully make him join the army, he went to seek the guerrilla. And that's when he joined the guerrilla at the age of 11. And unfortunately, he had to fight in the war for 3 years. And when he was 14, he recalls that his encampment, where, they were receiving the training, where the guerrilla was being, maintaining their headquarters, was bombarded. And, the army also started shooting at them. And my dad saw a bomb drop and he thought his life was going to end. But there was this banana tree that he will climb as a kid where he will get bananas. It was like this banana tree that was kind of his refuge from the reality that he was facing. He will play with the banana tree. And it's kind of like the irony, right? Because bananas were introduced to kind of amplify capitalism, right, through this monocultural agricultural process where they will export bananas from our countries. And he saw the bomb drop and he went to seek refuge under the banana tree, and instead of the bomb igniting, he saw how the banana leaves, in a what Western ways of knowing will probably call mystical or magical, wrap their ways so that the bomb wouldn't ignite. And my dad was really, I guess he was surprised and shocked because he thought his life was going to end, but the banana tree kind of saved him. And I think it ties back to the premises of, if we protect nature, nature will protect us. And in this case, banana trees, despite them being displaced as plants, they eventually became our displaced relatives. And it kind of provided my dad with a fresh start, and it's the reason why I can stand here today, tell his story, and have the privilege to also write it and put it in the book. So thank you for your question.
It's such a powerful story. And the way that you actually use banana leaves as a metaphor throughout the book is also really powerful. So thank you for sharing that, and your father for his courage and willingness to share that story with all of us. So I also wanted to talk about foods, our indigenous foods, because that's something that we really have in common between our work. So another reason I was all excited about this book, because foods really, our relationship to our indigenous foods reflects our broader relationship to the land. And then, and there's a long history of the ways in which these foods have been used to both oppress and control indigenous communities. And so, for example, in my own work, when in my own community, when the Dakota were removed from Minnesota in 1863, we lost access to the plants and animals that had been central to our traditional food system. And this is a story that was very common for tribes across the country. So our food sovereignty movement today is very much an indigenous-led movement to reclaim that relationship to foods, as well as our control of our ability to feed our own communities. So I was wondering if you would talk more about the indigenous and adopted foods, such as banana leaves, within your own community, and how your relationship to those foods has been shaped by the forced displacement to other countries.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think that oftentimes we face internal and external displacement. I see that, as somebody who had to leave and live in many different cities, obviously they're all indigenous lands, to go to school. And one of the things that I see living on Duwamish lands that are also known as Seattle is that there is this lack of, access to my traditional foods, given that, Seattle is one of the whitest cities in the United States. So as a result, we don't have the multicultural diversity that I had growing up in Los Angeles in California, where if we wanted to get banana trees, we can go to a local store or grocery store and get them. Where we wanted access to beans, we can also find our multiple beans that we have. And I think when I think of traditional foods, I think it kind of relates back to holidays and ceremonies, because as for my parents, they're the only ones displaced from our families. And that's because of war. My dad was always he's the eldest in his family. So all of his siblings were younger. So they weren't at that age where they were being forced to join the army or the guerrilla. And I think that when I think of ancestral foods, I kind of attach those memories of going back home, visiting my ancestral lands. And I think that there is this kind of this connection when I'm able to get banana trees banana leaves from the grocery store, as opposed to picking them up myself. And I think that, for me, it goes beyond just having access, because, I'm still missing, or there's this longing to be able to capture or hunt or, pick up or harvest my traditional foods, because it goes back to those kinships and those relationships that we built with our plants. And I think that as a result, right, many of our parents, especially indigenous peoples who are displaced from Latin America, you can find many fruit trees in our backyards, whether they be avocado trees. My father has a garden where he plants his, chiles, his peppers. And I think that it's different just being able to pick it up at the grocery store, as opposed to kind of, going back to your lands. And I think you can probably, share some of your experiences where you can build that connection, ask for, permission, as opposed to,
Mhm.
just swiping your debit card.
Uh-huh. Or you grow it yourself and you harvest it, and there is nothing like that, taking a food all the way from a seed to your table. It's that relationship piece that you talked about right in the beginning in your reading. I have to say, I was also struck by the compassion that you showed for the banana tree as a displaced plant. That, because there is that so much discussion around native plants, and and yes, valuing them because they've adapted to an area, but the value that comes with a plant that also was displaced and then and then became a valued member of a community.
Yeah, and I think that it's sometimes hard to talk about like invasive species being displaced relatives, right? Because Western conservation teaches us that, they are something that we should get rid of really aggressively. So
Yeah.
when we pick out weeds, or when we pick up invasive species, or kind of remove them, we do them in an aggressive way. And I
Mhm.
think just given that relationship that has been passed down to me through, from my father, and obviously from his grandparents, his parents, to, eventually to my generation, we see plants that are invasive as displaced relatives. And I think that
Mhm.
oftentimes, even in Western conservation, because it's not a diverse field, right? We don't have that many indigenous peoples, Black people doing conservation. People who do conservation kind of forget to build those relationships with those plants, especially a lot of the invasive plants come from Europe, and they forget to form those that relationship, right, that we as indigenous peoples have with their
Mhm.
relatives, right? Because at the end of the
Mhm.
day, those are plants that come from their ancestral lands, if they're from
Mhm.
Europe or have any roots there.
And that actually makes me think of another question. So one of the things that you did very effectively in the book was reframing concepts, environmental concepts in Western language. And one of them was restoration. And so the idea of restoration, from a Western perspective, would be you restore all of your native plants. And I think that's really too simplistic for what's happened in our landscapes today. And I'm wondering if you could just speak to your understanding of restoration, and how that it can include these displaced relatives.
Yeah, I often think of the impacts that climate change is having on native species, and just thinking about the Western red cedar and the importance it has to Coast Salish people, or, the territories where I currently reside in Seattle, and how the Western red cedar, as a result of climate change, is dying out. There's a lot of it has been dying out to the fact that, urban parks are no longer kind of planting Western red cedar, because, they're not thriving in the conditions that climate change has resulted on, and especially in Seattle, right? We were joking earlier how Seattle is very gray and rainy, but because of climate change, this summer we had extreme weather conditions where we have like extreme heat, and we're also having like heavier rain. So those native plants are no are not equipped to kind of manage or sustain those extreme weather conditions. So I think that because restoration continues to focus on just restoring that one species as opposed to looking at, those relationships that also plants have, right? Because as people, we have relationships with one another, especially in the indigenous cultures. We're taught that, even if we're from different tribes or nations, we still hold those relational, experiences and kinships with one another. And I think that with plants as well, the way that I have been taught is that they also hold a relationship with one another, but yet because of restoration, like you were mentioning, is very linear. It fails to recognize that maybe there are other plants that can be helping, our native plants thrive, especially as climate change conditions
Mhm,
make it hard for them to even survive
mhm.
during these times.
Yeah, I love that. I love that way of thinking about restoration, because that's, when we talk about assimilation and what has been taken away, then restoration is kind of the flip side of that, especially in landscape discussions. So thank you for just bringing that perspective to this conversation. And I'm going to ask one more question because I see that there are questions kind of piling up. So I'll just throw one more out there for you. I want to quote something that you wrote. Indigenous peoples, especially those of us who have been displaced, must undergo a hard journey of healing because displacement, especially forced displacement, is not something we can heal from easily. I was wondering if you could share your grandmother's teaching and how her words have supported you on your healing journey.
Yeah, one of the things that I was taught as a little girl was that, if as long as I lived in the United States, I was not in my ancestral lands. And one of the things that my grandmother will always share with me, especially in individual conversations, was that anywhere I went, especially that were not my lands, I was an unwelcome guest. And I think that she taught me to look at environments as someone's homes, and that someone is the indigenous peoples and communities whose lands I am occupying or displaced on. And I think that being taught that you are a welcome guest, you have to build those relationships so that you can become a welcome guest, so that people can welcome them in, welcome you into their homes. And I think that oftentimes in Western conservation, while there's a big push for people to, kind of rebuild kinships with their environments, because it's the way that through traditional ecological knowledge, they always fail to recognize that they also have to build relationships with the indigenous peoples whose lands they're trying to build relationships with. And I think that through that teaching, I have in a way lived my life where I built relationships with the indigenous peoples where whose lands I'm occupying or displaced on, and also build relationships with the lands and use that privilege, right, that PhD in environmental sciences has granted me to kind of support their environmental work. Because oftentimes, as you probably can recall as well, our people are denied or, kind of silenced because they don't have those Western credentials, right? For so
Mhm.
many years, we have seen how our indigenous knowledges haven't been validated because, we don't, our grandparents don't hold that PhD, or they don't hold that privilege, right, to have been writing books about our knowledge for so many years, right? Because there's so many books written about our people, and, you know, thanks to authors like yourself and others who have written indigenous scholarship, we're seeing more indigenous scholarship written by indigenous peoples, but that hasn't been the case for so long.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna, let's see, we've got a few questions here that are in, I think they're the same in the chat and the Q&A. So I'm going to start there. So this is Vern via Renzo. Just as your father developed a strong connection to the banana tree, is there a non-human being you've developed your own strong relationship to?
I think let's see, what is a strong being? I think that I have built strong relationships with a lot of like the birds and animals and the flora. I think that as somebody who studied forestry, I think I have the strongest relationship with trees. Just because I feel like they hold so much knowledge, they hold so many stories, because trees are older, we have a lot of old growth that are like as old as 1,000 years or more. So I would
Mm,
say trees would be the one thing that I
mm,
really love.
mhm.
And yourself, do you have any relationships as well?
Oh, I actually I live on 10 acres, and the reason I moved here was because of a tamarack bog, which is just a unique habitat, and it's original to this landscape for I don't know how many years back. So to me, that's just that's where my heart is with those tamarack trees and learning about that original landscape here. It feels like a connection back to my ancestors, because this is the way one piece of the landscape might have looked all those generations ago. So here's another question. Every word we choose to speak gives that language power. Can you share and I don't know how to pronounce this, CH apostrophe ORTI,
Yeah, Torti.
word that is powerful to you?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't speak Chorti. That is my father's language. And I think that that has to do with the fact that his language kind of carries the trauma from war. And I
Mm,
think that, sometimes we forget, at least I have been taught that, sometimes our native languages also carry that trauma. And for many of our elders, it's sometimes hard to speak their languages, right? Because they remember when they had to speak their languages. And for my father, because he had to be forced to join the war at a young age, his language kind of carries that trauma from the war. But I do speak Zapotec, and I think the word that kind of has a strong meaning to me and that kind of is like related to the book is Rianda. And Rianda is just basically, it means healing. And I think
mm,
that it's kind of like I write in my book how it's like one of the closest words that we have in my native Zapotec that kind of relates to conservation, but doesn't necessarily translate to conservation, but it
mm,
translates more to healing or protecting our environments or and our plant and animal relatives.
mhm.
And what
Yeah.
about yourself? Do you have a word that has a strong meaning in your
You
language?
know, so I'm still in the early stage of trying to relearn my language, but there is a phrase, mitakuye owasi, that means we are all related. And that, to me, that's the one that I try to carry closely, because it just reminds me I have a responsibility to all of my relatives around me. So, and it just shifts the way you think about the world. That in that relationship, it's everything. It's our soil, it's our plants, our animals, our air, our water, everything around us. We are in that relationship. So that's the one that I try to keep in mind. So here's another one. As you note in your book, the banana and coffee industries have both caused massive global injustices. But what happens when a foreign entity stays long enough to adapt and develop relationships to its new habitat and co-inhabitants? How then do you negotiate what are the best actions to take ecologically and socially?
So do you think they're referring to entities as like plants or the corporations?
You know, it starts out saying industries. What happens when a foreign entity? So um, I'm
Awesome.
thinking it's industries, corporations.
I think it, and maybe you can also add on to that. I think that the best way for them to build those relationships, especially moving forward, is through the land back movement. And
Mm,
I think that
mhm,
because, as I mentioned, a lot of our indigenous lands in Central America were stolen from our people and they were sold through land grabs, right? Where they didn't just receive 1 acre of land, they received like hundreds of
mm,
acres or even thousands of acres of land for them to establish these monocultural industries. And I think that through the land back movement, our indigenous peoples can kind of take back that, and I wouldn't say ownership, but that stewarding of our lands so
mhm,
that we can better manage them. And
mhm,
even today, climate change is impacting those large agricultural systems that are, monoculture, because, when they have heavy rains during hurricane seasons or extreme droughts, they're losing a lot of their crops because, these crops were not, the monocultural industry tends to kind of, again, and we would, I'm tying it back to the conversation we just had, forgets to, build that plant relationships with other plants so that these plants can thrive a little bit better, especially in not, and not in their ancestral lands. And I think I would say the land back movement would probably be the best approach for me. I don't know. Do you have any other suggestions?
Well, I also think, I think about corn a lot growing because I'm in a state that is a corn state, which means millions of acres of genetically modified seeds. And yet when we try to grow our traditional corn, you're surrounded by all these fields. And if your corn is cross-pollinated by the wind, then you could actually be sued for stealing that patented material, not to mention it destroys your corn. So to me, you have to, we've learned to take somewhat, well, you've learned to protect your corn, for example, in different ways, which is to try to segregate it, try to time it. You can hand pollinate it. But, I also really encourage people wherever I go to pay attention to what you purchase. So that if you buy something that has genetically modified ingredients in it, that has GMO corn in it, you're supporting those fields. And so I just think we can make those small choices that are actually, they add up, grassroots movements to make choices in the way that our food systems actually will respond to the marketplace.
Kind of reminds me of like the holiday season, right? How a lot of the poinsettia is also genetically modified, and because there's such a high commercial value for it, especially during the holiday season. People are just purchasing them, and they're purchasing genetically modified poinsettia that is not being harvested, as you were mentioning. It just reminded me of that example, especially
to be intentional about what because we do live, I mean, there's very few of us that have the ability to really provide our own food anymore, or much of it. But you can be very intentional in knowing who is producing it and how did they grow it. So, and then, and it's a way to support those small farmers too. So I think we can make changes that way. So another person would like to know more about Pina Sol, SPC, and how founding that came about.
Yeah, so Pina Sol is like a small business that I have, and it's a social purpose corporation. And I think that one of the ways, or one of the reasons why I founded it, was because I wanted to help my relatives back in my ancestral lands, because they're artisans, right? So they sell a lot of embroidery, a lot of beading, but because they are often, having to sell to tourists, they're often haggled, for their pieces. Like people end up paying like $2 for a pair of beaded earrings, and sometimes they have to sell them at those low prices because that's the only economic sustainability that they can have, especially as even in Latin America, indigenous peoples continue to be oppressed, so we don't get that many economic or educational opportunities. And I wanted to found that because I started kind of selling some of my beaded products and also some of their products via Twitter, social media. And I think that it was there. I saw that people were actually interested in buying directly from the artisan, and I wanted to support them. And I think that that's why I established Pina Sol, which is kind of like a hybrid between consultation, because oftentimes as indigenous peoples, we're asked for free labor, but now I can direct them to, oh, here's my consultation, business. You can hire me through there. And it's also a hybrid between artesania. So we have like an online small store where I'm able to support my relatives, especially during the pandemic. It was really helpful to do that because there was no tourism during those times.
Is the website at www.pinasol.com?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, because that, what a tremendous opportunity to be able to buy directly from the artisans themselves. Yeah. And is that SPC too? Is that part of that?
Yeah. it's a social purpose corporation. So it's like a and
Okay,
business entity that,
gotcha,
Seattle, Washington State has.
gotcha. Okay. And then another attendee asked, I heard you say the book explores your father's story. Does it also follow your family's life and childhood in Los Angeles?
Yeah, I think in terms of like following my childhood, it doesn't really necessarily follow it. I think it's more embedded in the stories that my ancestral lands carry. And I think I briefly mentioned my childhood during, when I kind of talk about Latinidad, which is, the Latinx identity that kind of fails to recognize that, we do have Black people, we do have Afro-Indigenous peoples and
Mhm.
Indigenous peoples who continue to be oppressed in Latin America, right? This is not to say that Latinx people don't face oppression in the United States, because there is xenophobia, but
Mhm.
it kind of, many Latinx people walked that duality of becoming the oppressed and the oppressor, right? Because in
Mhm.
Latin
Mhm.
America, these settler frameworks benefit whiteness. And obviously, whiteness in Latin America looks different than whiteness in the United States. Yet, there's this failed recognition that, we do have settlers in Latin America and we do have settler colonialism that kind of fails to recognize that Latinidad is just like this umbrella framework that doesn't really embody the dualities, especially bring justice to Black, people from Latin America, Afro-Indigenous, Indigenous peoples as well. But that's like the only brief mention I have for my childhood.
Mhm. And so Rashana asked, I love your background, Jessica, and I wondered if there is something that you would be willing to share about what that bird is in the black and white photo. So the background behind you.
Okay, yeah. So this is just a collage that was done by a Oaxacan artist. And basically the bird is a torogos, which is like the national bird of El Salvador. It's a relative to us. It's like on a banana tree, and then we have collage pictures of like Zapotec woman, and also Mayan woman, because that's kind of like the important premises of the book, because I focus more on indigenous women, and there's a guerrilla soldier, a child soldier as well. So it's kind of like a collage picture.
Mhm.
And there's clouds because in the Zapotec community, we're known as the cloud people just because we live in high altitudes in the mountains. So yeah.
Mm. Yeah, it's just beautiful.
Yeah, thank you.
Um, Zoom, it's just such a strange environment. It's good to have some color. um, so let's see, I actually have I have a writing question for you. I'm curious about just how you came up with the format of your book, and because first books can always be a big challenge, and they can often come with a lot of self-doubt, and was this a hard book to write? Was this just talk to us about what it was like for you as a first time writing your first book.
Yeah, so for me, I think it's more of like after writing the book, as you probably know, as authors, we have to get used to like positive and negative critique, which I mean, they're both valid. But I think that one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book was because oftentimes when we talk about indigeneity, especially in the environmental discourse, it's written in a way that's very romanticized, that,
Mhm.
it kind of either, right, it's written to make us more vulnerable, or it's written in the anthropological lens where we're still these mystical creatures prancing and dancing with nature, even though as we both have explored in our book, sometimes our indigeneity is kind of like being intentional, right, rebuilding those intentions that are often lost because of the histories that our indigenous communities kind of carry. So I wanted to write a book that also embody testimonies and direct quotations from people, indigenous women and other relatives and communities members that I interview, as opposed to, summarizing those interviews, because, like, for instance, having a PhD kind of gives me that privilege and also that responsibility where, you know, I can have the privilege to uplift their stories directly the way that they told them. Obviously, I translated them into the language of English. And I think that it was healing to write during the pandemic in a way, like if I look at the positive side, because I was able to Zoom with a lot of people, do phone calls with a lot of people to get their testimonies, kind of have that um, you know, kind of sharing those stories with my father, my mother. And I think that it was healing in that way. But, you know, the scary part is now that, you know, once the book is out, obviously it's the readers, you know, they're either going to love it or hate it or be indifferent. And I think that, you know, because sometimes when we write personal books, like your book as well, you know, it's kind of like, oh, it's my personal story. Like,
Mhm.
you know, it's, are they
Yeah,
criticizing the writing or my story?
right. It's hard to separate that
Uh-huh.
sometimes, you know, because those books are so close to your heart
Yeah.
that it just feels like it's coming at you. It's your baby.
Yeah.
You know, you talk a lot too in your book, or you write a lot about your experience in graduate school, which especially the way in which your knowledge as an Indigenous woman was often attacked or belittled. And so two questions. Is this book partly a response to that, standing up for your own opinions and thoughts and knowledge? And then also, what kept you going? How did you, I mean, you know, I've seen how often Indigenous students struggle to stay in college because of that, the pressures on them. And so a twofold question there.
Yeah, so I think that when I was writing this book, it wasn't written to, you know, kind of in a way kind of go back to what I was told by people or you know how my knowledge was as this. It just came out. And I think that oftentimes when we have those microaggressions or those experiences, we tend to say, oh, we brushed it off, right? But when you write or when you're thinking or you doing some act of healing, those things tend to resurface. And I think as writing the book and talking about my lived experiences, my indigenous communities, those experiences came back and I was like, oh, I thought I had, you know, let that go, or I thought, you know, it wasn't a big deal, or I had dismissed it. But I think in a way, writing that book kind of showed me that oftentimes when we face those things as indigenous peoples, whether it be a microaggression or, you know, something that, you know, dismissal of our knowledges, dismissal of our lived experiences actually has a huge impact on us. And I think that that shocked me a lot because, you know, as a student, I was like, you know, I let that go. You know, it's just them, their white fragility. But we forget that, you know, it actually has an impact on us and we
Mhm.
carry that under the surface. And I think that using the writing as healing kind of allow me to, in a way, heal from that because, you know, obviously it's hurtful to be laughed at or be, you know, share something about your grandparents and then be questioned because it's not written down in, you know, in the Western way of peer review articles or, you know, especially in the sciences, right? They, you know,
Mhm.
we love to cite peer review articles, but not so much lived experiences. And
Yeah.
have you experienced something like that as well, or?
I just encounter huge fear anytime I'm going to put anything out in the world. You know, and that can be from multiple directions, not only um, for, you know, it can come from people who are challenging what it is I'm saying. It can come from within my own community sometimes, just from our own internalized um, assimilation. And so I just have to really, as I'm writing, really think through what is it that I want to say that I'm going to stand for no matter what. So
Yeah,
what
sometimes
was
it's
it
hard,
that,
right?
yeah, it is,
Yeah.
it's a, and that's in, you know, in addition to just writing and publishing in general, when everybody gets to have an opinion about your work, you know, which is what we sign up for. Yes,
Yeah.
we want to be part of the conversation. But what was it that kept you going then? All those years to get a PhD is a lot of years and commitment.
Yeah, so I think what kept me going, and I often ask myself this, is just that that my parents always told me that my education was like the best thing they could give me, especially being the, as I mentioned, the only people displaced from our families into the United States. Like, we were the only ones who had access to education. I saw, my cousins struggle to even be able to go to school because, over there, you often, material, school supplies, they're not given. You have to buy basically everything. Sometimes, I even say, oh, you probably have to buy your own desk to sit on in class, right? Because they sell everything, especially in rural communities where indigenous communities live. And I think it was just that ingrained in me that, education was important. And I think that it goes back to, I'm very similar to my grandmother, who was very, sometimes stubborn, because I don't know if,
Mhm.
if you believe in horoscopes, where we were both, she was a Capricorn as well. And I
Mhm.
think it's just that persistence that I wanted to do that. And I ended up, completing my PhD in 3 years. So I kind of did it really fast, just
Mhm.
because I wanted to get it out of the way. But yeah, it was a lot of work. But for my PhD, I had a great supportive advisor who, I owe it to her to have been allow me
Mhm.
to guide me. But as you mentioned, not every student, especially indigenous students, are lucky
Mhm.
to, have a supportive advisor or find that support system in school.
Mhm. And be, you got to be stubborn. You got
Yeah.
to, and I have to believe that your family's faith in you and help carry you through. Uh, we have a question um, from Emmanuel. If you have some books or comics or other things that you'd recommend reading wise.
Yeah, obviously your book as well. Do you want to talk about what your book is about, or?
Well, I will briefly. So The Seed Keeper is a novel about four Dakota women from different generations, just their experience with survival and trying to protect their way of life and how seeds, and it's that same message, which is why I was so excited about your book. If we take care of the seeds will take care of us. And that's part of the original agreement that human beings have always had. And so trying to get back to that, excuse me. So that's what the story really is about. But do you have other books as well that?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of, I know that there is this Mayan book written by Dr. Emil. Um, let's see if I can find it. Because for me, like, it's important to find books that are written by indigenous people south of the border,
Mhm.
because I think that that was important for me, especially writing Fresh Banana Leaves. I'm trying to find his book. I will share it shortly. Obviously your book, I really enjoy writing, I mean, not writing, but reading your book. Because I really love books written by indigenous women, especially given that, we live in a colonial and patriarchal world that
Mhm.
oftentimes closes doors for us. um I have another book called Disorders Cosmos that's written by a Black physicist that kind of explores, anti-Blackness and physics, especially in
Mhm.
STEM.
Oh, interesting.
Do you have other books as well? I'm trying to think
There's
of.
one that I really love, Native Science by Greg Coyetti. And it's just, it's, really trying to understand an indigenous perspective on science. And I just love it. It's, it's so, it's when you, it's when it was one of the books that helped me understand just how profound this perspective is in terms of the way indigenous people have always related to the world, and how sophisticated it is. So that's that one I treasure. Um, boy, you know how it is when people ask you about books, your mind goes Disordered Cosmos. Yes, that's the book. Um, and I know we are getting close to the end of this time. So I just wanted to make sure that I congratulate you, Jessica, on your new book. And do you have other or plans for writing more books? What's next for you?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm gonna continue writing books maybe in a couple of
Uh-huh.
years.
A lot of work.
But yeah. What about yourself? Do you have any books coming out or that you're writing?
I'm writing essays right now, because that's one of the ways I can really delve more deeply into these issues around Indigenous foods and our relationship, in children's books too, because I really feel it's important that we make sure we're passing on this knowledge to the next generation. Yeah, so any closing words that you have that you'd like to offer to the audience? Anything you hope that people will take away from reading this book?
Yeah, thank you for, having me. And it was a beautiful conversation to have with you, Diane. And I think that, it's important to support Indigenous scholarship written by Indigenous peoples because, we have so much Indigenous scholarship that's written for us, and not by us. And I think that, it's important to shift that narrative so that, we can continue to not just be the first ones, right? But to continue having a line of Indigenous writers coming forward as, we continue to live on this earth. So
Mhm.
thank you for, this
Yes.
beautiful conversation.
Oh, it's just been a pleasure to read your book and to get to know you and to at least be in conversation on Zoom, and I got to see your beautiful background. So
Oh, thank you.
yeah. So Carolina, is there anything else in the other bookstore business?
No, I just want to reiterate, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been amazing. Definitely everyone who's viewing, check out the book, check out all the books that have been recommended. We have the book available in store. You can also order it online for pickup or shipping. And yeah, thank you so much. Just everyone in the chat is just agreeing that this conversation has been great. And so we really appreciate it. Thank you so much, both of you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Well, good luck with your book, Jessica.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you again.
Okay. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Catalina.